Today, I want to welcome our new city forester, Bennett Myhran. Bennett started with the city in April of 2016 as a public service worker in the Parks Department and was recently promoted this year to city forester. Congratulations, Bennett. Good to have you.
Thank you, Mayor. Thanks for having me.
So, city forester, how do you get from working with the city in public works to becoming the city forester?
Well, it was kind of a natural progression for me. I started with the city, like you said, in 2016, primarily doing the ornamental gardens around town. So the flower beds that you see down along Lake Street, planters at the Muni, up here at City Hall, all that kind of stuff. And I love doing that. I did that a lot before I worked with the city. I worked for Otten Brothers out in Long Lake doing all sorts of landscape stuff, garden installations, and
Sure.
a little bit of design. So I really enjoyed that. But, as the years went by, there was more and more need for some tree expertise because, our ordinance calls for it. It has. We just rewrote our ordinance last fall, but there's been certain standards that we have to watch for when it comes to development and stuff. So a lot of those questions fell in my lap just because it's kind of adjacent to what I was doing, I guess.
Okay.
And I've embraced that. And over the years, I've educated myself with the help of the city. Done some classwork at the U of M with Gary Johnson, who is a tremendous resource in the world of urban forestry. We're lucky to have him so close. And then got my arborist certification, tree risk assessment qualification, and recently I got my certification from the MNLA, which is kind of all about landscape design and garden stuff.
Fantastic.
So I kind of did that in reverse order.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Those are great qualifications to have because we certainly love our flowers and our trees here in town. And I do want to talk about the ordinance a little bit.
Sure.
Not to go too deep into it, and I certainly don't have it memorized, but
Nor do I.
It's been a point of conversation certainly over the years. But hats off to you. I mean, like I said, we love our flowers in town, and it is one of the things that our volunteers, along with staff, the rest of the community has come to appreciate so much.
Yeah.
I know my own mother, when she would come to visit, would always comment on how beautiful the flowers were around
really?
town. Oh, yeah.
Oh, that's great to hear.
Yeah. So it's always fun to get our hands dirty, too, and
Yeah.
help plant.
Yeah.
And
Well, and it's a fun place to do that sort of stuff because it always, since I've worked here, it's always been such a community thing.
Mhm.
We have Dig It Day and Pull It Day.
Sure.
Which lots of people attend every year, but also throughout the year, there's people around town that volunteer to take care of, whatever garden, in their neighborhood or at the beach. They help out a lot, and we get to learn from each other, and it's great. I don't think every community is like that.
That's great. So between flowers and trees, do you have a preference one way or the other, or what kind of speaks to you more?
Yeah, good question. Both.
Mhm.
So when I'm at home, I love gardening.
Mhm.
I spend a lot of time in my front garden at home. I think it drives my wife nuts.
Also,
But well,
the amount of time?
Yeah. It's but it's a family endeavor, It's fun to have. We have a 3-year-old, and he loves digging around with me out there and pulling
that's
weeds
great.
and pulling flowers too.
Yeah.
Not just weeds. He's learning.
Well,
Yeah. So at home, it's mostly gardening because we have a small yard. But here, it's awesome to just focus on the trees, especially because I see the trees as not that they're more important. Well, they are in a lot of ways. I mean, it affects all of us in a more tangible way than our ornamental gardens, and
Mhm.
so I see that as a really valuable resource that we have, and I think most communities are seeing it that way now. But it's becoming a more and more important theme every year. So I'm happy to be a part of that.
That's fantastic. You mentioned something about your son
Yeah.
pulling flowers versus weeds. And I think we had this conversation when I was talking about traveling around the state of Minnesota and wildflowers.
Yeah.
And I have this thing about wherever I go, I take pictures of flowers or things that I think look pretty. And I think you said, well, some people would consider those weeds and other people consider them flowers. And it's true, right? It's a
all relative.
Personal perspective of what speaks to you as an individual. And one person's weed is another person's flower.
That's a very good way to put it. There's a lot of disagreements in the gardening community about lots of different flowers or weeds. But then sometimes the DNR gets involved and they say, no, seriously, you can't plant that stuff. And so then we have to play by the rules. But But yeah, it's all relative.
Okay, so I know we're here to talk about trees, but now I'm curious. You piqued my interest. Yeah. So what can you give me like one or two examples of the things like the DNR would say, absolutely do not plant this in your garden?
Yeah, the interesting thing about the Minnesota Department of Agriculture has a more comprehensive list, and they categorize it by there's certain plants that they would call restricted, meaning that you can only use them in certain ways. There's some that are totally banned. Like common buckthorn would be an example of that.
Yeah, please don't plant those in Wayzata.
Yeah. And people did. I mean, that's how they got here. People were planting them as hedges, and they perform really well as hedges. I don't blame people for doing that. It just got out of control. But every year there's new additions on those lists. And this year, there's some interesting ones like amber maple.
I'm not familiar with that.
You've seen it all around town. It's very common. It's kind of a dwarf clump maple with really tremendous fall color. And the leaf shape is less like a traditional sugar maple shape and more like a Japanese maple. Okay. So like extra serrated, kind of like more like your hand than a what a maple leaf looks like. Yeah. So that was one that was added to the list that they're trying to discourage people from planting. So every year there's a few. And
that's a tree?
It is. It's kind of a shrub, high, something in between. It's usually a clump, but people use it as a garden tree. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. Every year there's a handful of those that, they don't come out of the blue. I mean, we've known that they have some concerning tendencies. Usually it has to do with how they spread. Sure. So amber maples they tend to produce a whole lot of seed, and they're understory trees. So they're starting to take over some understories in native woodlands. Okay. Which we want to avoid. There's other stuff like that on the list this year too, like Japanese tree lilac. That was not added there was a lot of talk of that being added to the list this year. It was not. I'm guessing next year it probably will be, which is too bad. That's a beautiful ornamental. It is, yeah. And that's a really popular one to use like underneath power lines. Okay. Because usually that's in a boulevard along a street. It flowers, it stays, smaller, so it never gets up there and becomes an issue with utilities. So it's an interest. There's an interesting science behind all that.
So it's ever evolving.
It is, yeah. Interesting.
So we talk about our native forests, our native trees. Yeah. We're very fortunate in Wayzata. I'd like you to talk a little bit about the big woods. Yeah. Because we have a very special area here in town that's been preserved. Can you talk a little bit about the history of the big woods and the types of trees and why that understory, it's so important that we keep things like buckthorn and garlic mustard out of it?
Yeah, the big woods is a very special place. And it's special because it's a remnant of the original native big woods subset, a subsection of our ecosystem, which pre-colonization that contained American elm, basswood, red oak, and sugar maple. And all of those are still represented in the big woods. And a lot of them are pushing 200 years old because that site was never touched, it's pretty rare around here. And actually the big woods subsection is actually not that big to begin with. And it's mostly west of the Twin Cities, kind of a big oval shape west of the Twin Cities. And so if you can picture that on a map, it's like, well, a lot of that is developed suburban type towns. So,
or it's been farmed.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of it's been farmed, or it was farmed and then kind of reverted back to like a development, like a neighborhood development. The vast majority of that was lost throughout those processes. So that's probably what's most special about it. And I think a lot of people recognize that. And that's why there's lots of volunteers that organize things throughout the year in effort to remove buckthorn, garlic mustard. We don't do any like conventional maintenance that, with our street trees, we do, regular pruning and occasionally we'll, fertilize and water when we need to, all that stuff. It's kind of a different category. It's truly a preservation. We don't touch it unless a tree falls on the trail, and in which case we go in there, we chop off exactly the length or the width of the trail and move that one piece of the log, leave it out there.
Yeah.
Because we're recognizing that this is all
part of what's supposed to happen. Absolutely.
Yeah. And we're trying to keep it that way.
That's great.
So really special place.
We do have some trails so people can go out and enjoy it.
Yeah.
Pardon me. We do ask that people stay on the trails.
Yes.
And there's some wildlife there that can be observed. We have some wild turkeys and some different species of birds. I'm not going to ask you which ones those are. You're the tree specialist.
I'm not the one to ask, but
right.
I know there are birds in there. I have seen them.
Yes. And we have a maple tree tapping event that happens in the spring. So Marilee Babcock manages that.
Yep.
And that's fun for families and people around town to be able to do. Yeah. And that is just a great place to just go enjoy nature.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
It's stunning. Are there any other remnants of the Big Woods left, or is this truly the last one?
There's one, and I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. There is one, if you go down Highway 6 towards Long Lake, there's a church, and to the east of that church, there's a big woodland that is, I think it's a DNR property. I could be wrong. But that's kind of a similar site with a similar mix of species that everyone should check out if they haven't been there. That's cool too.
Absolutely. Okay. Yeah. Sorry, I got completely off script here. I know I have some questions.
Good questions.
And we'll probably go off script again. So, the tree canopy analysis. Yes. So you were starting that initiative. Tell us about that. What does that mean?
Well, we are always trying all sorts of things to gather new information about the trees in Wayzata, both public and private. I mean, whatever we can do, because it's all connected. I mean, the trees don't know if they're public or private.
Right.
So the canopy analysis is something that I started working on over the winter, and I use a software called iTree, which is a super useful resource for lots of things, all things trees, basically. But this particular piece of software is called iTree Canopy, and basically it's a map, a satellite imagery of the city of Wayzata, and the software spits out random crosshairs of satellite imagery somewhere in Wayzata. And it does this 1,000 times, literally 1,000 times.
Okay.
And the user, in this case, me, has to tell the software, is this a tree or a shrub? Is it a grass? Is it an impervious surface? Is it a building? Is it water? There's a long list of different categories. So you do this, stare at the computer for hours, clicking boxes. And at the end, it builds this report that provides a lot of useful data. But I think what I found especially interesting about it is that we currently are sitting at about 36% canopy cover.
Okay.
For most cities I would say most cities in the Midwest, the goal is 40%, and that's kind of a pie in the sky. Like that'd be awesome.
Sure.
And we're already at 36, which is great. That said, I don't want to take that for granted. It's not like that's something
Right.
you can just, oh, we're in good shape. We don't have to worry about trees anymore. I think in my mind, it demonstrates how precious of a resource we have.
And how quickly it can be lost.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure.
And I think that 36% number is especially impressive because if you look at the map, so much of Wayzata is Wayzata Bay.
Sure.
So really that it makes that number all that much more impressive. So that's something that we should all be proud of in some sense.
So what will we do with that data? So how will we take that and then apply it to what we do on a day-to-day basis at the city?
Yeah, that data in particular is that's kind of a big picture thing. And basically we just want to, all the decisions that we make, whether it's making adjustments to our tree ordinance, developing a planting plan for the spring, buying new tree stock, maintenance stuff, whatever, we're always thinking whatever we do, we want to maintain or expand on that figure. Cause us too, we would love to see 40%, and we're actually not that far away, but we have to be proactive about it because I think anyone can see whether you don't have to be a tree geek to see that, ash trees, when they're coming down left and right, you have 2 years of drought that stresses trees out and they fall victim to that. So those are just a few reasons why you have to keep that in the back of your head. Like, yes, we have a lot of really mature, nice trees in Wayzata, but they're not going to live forever. And it seems like we're losing them faster than we were.
Yeah.
So we need to be intentional about replacing them preemptively, because when a tree comes down, you can't just stick one in the ground and call it a day. I mean, we can, and we do in those situations, but
Sure.
It would be better if when a tree fails for whatever reason, there's a well-established tree already there that's going to fill that hole in the canopy. You're not starting from scratch.
Absolutely. So you talked about a couple of things that I want to talk a little bit more about. One is EAB, and the other is tree replacement. But it triggered a memory. I'm not going to remember exactly how many years ago this was, but it was when we had those massive, massive windstorms that came through.
Yeah.
And we lost power for like 3-4 days throughout the city. And there were so many massive trees that went down. In the moment, that was incredibly devastating. So can you do an assessment then of like the loss of those trees from an event like that, and then how we would replant going forward?
Yeah.
Some of those were private, obviously.
Sure.
Some were city, but I just remember driving all around the city and just amazed at the number of trees that we had lost.
Yeah. If it's the event that I think it is, it was probably 2012.
I think so. Okay.
So when I mentioned that we have a lot of different ways that we collect data about trees. The canopy analysis is just one piece of that. The more detailed kind of ground level assessment is done through our regular inventory process, which is looking at individual trees, measuring their diameter, grading their health, looking for hazardous conditions. And those are the numbers that would get updated when we're responding to a big storm like that.
Okay.
So when we're, looking at, and it could be private trees too, because usually if a private tree fails and it falls in public right of way, that's us that's going to come and clean that up.
Sure.
And in that process, we do look at, what caused this failure. Even though we know, like in 2012, we knew, wind caused the failure, but there's more to it than that. When you get there, you can look at, where was was it a bad branch union? Was it drought related, initially? It could be any number of things. And those are the things that you want to look for when you're there in the moment. And you're going to take note of that in our tree inventory. And then when you're picking the next tree to replace that one that you lost, you keep that in mind. This is maybe there's a wind tunnel here that we need to be prepared for because we know it's going to happen again. Silver maples are a really popular tree.
Sure.
That are planted. We don't have so many of them here as we do in St. Louis Park where I live. Mm-hmm. But they're notorious for just bad growth habit.
Interesting.
They kind of grow like a flower bouquet. Mm-hmm. Like they've got like a dozen trunks all just growing upright in parallel, which is not how a tree is supposed to grow.
No, but they look so cool.
They do. They do. And they're really good trees if they're trained to be good trees. It's like it's like a dog.
Yeah.
You
absolutely.
So you want to have one central leader.
Okay.
And kind of thoughtful branch unions.
Yeah.
So when they're young, if you revisit them each year, and every species is a little different, but in general in the winter is the best time to look at them and do some structural pruning. When they're young, fast growing species like silver maple, you want to train them to be solid and to hopefully stand up to those wind events that you're remembering, because you're right, that's a huge problem, and some of that can be mitigated by tree maintenance.
And so if people have questions about that, they can reach out to a company that specializes in tree maintenance, and they can provide some input into making sure that the trees are healthy and safe. So that's the other aspect, right? We don't just, trees are wonderful, but we also need a safe community.
Absolutely.
We don't want them falling on people's houses and across roads. We talk about tree replacement, and I believe it was when I started on the council back in 2015. We started the bare root tree program. Yeah. So I was really fascinated. I didn't even know you could do something like that, because I was used to going to a nursery and you have a root ball with the dirt. And so can you talk a little bit about that program that we have at Public Works?
Yeah. Yeah. So that, we've been doing that since I started here, and it's a really cool way to go about tree planting. Basically, so it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a bare root. It's a tree that has no soil. It's just the trunk, it's the canopy, it's the roots underneath. And we place an order usually in the winter, and they show up. We've got a gravel bed at Public Works, which is basically just a big pit full of pea rock.
Okay.
And there's an irrigation system out there, and we get these trees and we stick them in the gravel bed, roots in the pea rock, and they get watered about twice, depending on the season, usually twice a day.
Okay.
For about 3 minutes at a time. Some of them we plant right away, but most of them we let them develop a stronger root system over the course of that growing season. Usually this shipment shows up in May, early May, and we're planting in early October. And in that short amount of time, the root systems quadruple in size.
Interesting.
And it's
more
all
so than in dirt.
Oh yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep. And it's a lot of very fine root hairs, which is what you're looking for. And the issue with some other planting formats, so like a ball and burlap tree from a nursery or a potted tree, they're in a container, and once they reach capacity, I guess, in that container, those roots start growing along the perimeter of that container.
And that's when you're, as a homeowner, trying to break that apart. Okay.
Yeah. And the reason for that is because those roots, as they develop their secondary growth, their girth, they will eventually, as the trunk gets bigger and the roots get bigger, it'll actually kill the tree. And sometimes it can take 20 years and sometimes less. But if they have that habit right from the get-go, it's kind of a guarantee.
Sure.
That the tree will fail. So with bare root trees, there is not any concern having to do with, those are called stem girdling roots. You don't have that concern because they have free reign to grow in their natural form. They're not contained to a container.
Sure. So we use those to replace the trees in boulevards and around different areas. Especially right now, we're contending with emerald ash borer. So it's confirmed. It's in Wayzata. Can you talk a little bit about the program we started several years ago with our volunteers, and then kind of where we are today in terms of what are we doing to help mitigate emerald ash borer?
Sure. Yeah. So emerald ash borer has been coming for 20 years or over 20 years now. And it's been something that we spent a lot of time preparing for in a lot of different ways. One of them was a volunteer inventory of public ash trees, which was very helpful to have that data. I mean, data is nothing better than good data.
It was fun too.
Yeah.
I got to do it with my kids, and we're up measuring trees and tree identification we learned about. So it was a lot of fun to be able to be part of something that we felt was going to benefit the city, and it's something so meaningful.
Yes, and it really did. I mean, because it takes a lot of time. I mean, we have to commit a lot of labor to just keeping track of all these trees that we're taking care of. So that was a great initiative. But it's been a multifaceted effort dealing with EAB. So it's inventory efforts. It's some treatment, which we didn't start until last spring, because EAB didn't show up until actually quite recently here. But there's been some preemptive removals. The first one that I can think of was in 2016, and that was Broadway Avenue North, basically between Wayzata Boulevard and the freeway, basically. That was originally planted with alternating green ash, hackberry, green ash, hackberry. And they were nearly mature trees, all of them. And so we knew that EAB would be here in a year, 5 years. We didn't really know.
Sure.
But, these trees were starting to get crowded out. We had these beautiful hackberries that, would still leave us with a full canopy down Broadway. So we thought, let's get rid of the ash and we'll plant in some new stuff, because it's important to have a mix of age groups in your canopy as well.
Not just species, but age.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, diversity of species, and actually genus, more importantly. That's
where your science background's coming into play.
Well, I think it's an important distinction to make, because when we're talking about diversity as a defense to pests and pathogens, the genus level is what is important to keep in mind, because all of the crazy invasive pests that we've dealt with up until now have targeted particular genus, not species. So
good to know, but I'm going to steal that when we're in a council meeting talking about trees.
Yeah.
I'm going to say, well, Bennett told me.
Please do. Yeah.
It's the genus, not the species, folks.
Yeah. Yes. It's good to have a mix of species, but, so American elm trees, they were all attacked or they all got the Dutch elm disease,
sure.
Virtually all of them. And we lost virtually all of them. And that fungal disease didn't care if it was a rock elm or a red elm or it was looking at that genus, American elm. And that we've found that to be the case with emerald ash borer. It doesn't particularly seem to care if it's a black ash or a green ash or, it just likes American ash trees.
Sure.
So we're kind of using that as looking ahead to what the next bug might be, or the next disease. We want to be prepared as best we can in terms of diversification. So apparently a genus is what to look at.
All right.
So how's that for a long-winded?
No, I like it. But it's interesting, because we always have a little bit of melancholy, right, when we hear, oh, we're going to have to take down some trees, because we're working so hard to try and preserve trees wherever we can.
Yes.
And so many of our neighborhoods have these beautiful canopies. You mentioned Broadway Avenue North. That is one of the most beautiful canopies in the fall and in the summer. So we're taking steps, to eradicate, dangerous, disease trees, trees that are harmful, or could potentially cause some harm. And then we're using the bare root trees that are at Public Works to try and replace those along the way as well.
Yeah, we replace the trees that are, especially in like a boulevard or park setting, where we're replacing them kind of immediately. There are other kind of more obscure parts of town where it's kind of a long-term replacement plan that we implement kind of as we chip away at the removals. So it's kind of a mixed bag there, but yes, in general, we're mostly using bare root trees to replace these ash. And then the other piece of that EAB response is the injection treatment,
sure,
which I mentioned. So we started that last year.
When will we know if that's been effective?
Well, it's been proven to be effective in other parts of the country. There's a long track record, especially in Michigan. EAB was first identified in the Detroit area, and it's worked its way out. But this systemic insecticide that they use has 15 plus years of proven effectiveness.
Excellent.
Yeah, so we feel really good about, really confident that it'll work. So the trees that we're selecting for treatment, we're looking at them as kind of indefinite long-term commitments to preserve these trees, because I would predict that in 10 years, ash trees are going to be rare in Wayzata. Okay. And the only ash trees that will be here are going to be ones that receive treatment and are still continuing to receive treatment.
And we contract that out, correct?
We do, yeah. We have an agreement with Rainbow Tree Care. So it's a good price that we get for our public trees, and Wayzata residents can take advantage of for their own private ash trees.
That's fantastic. So do they just get a hold of Rainbow Tree Care and let them know they're a Wayzata resident?
Yep.
If they suspect they have an ash tree or want to preemptively have it treated?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. It's best to treat them before you see any signs of emerald ash borer. But you can have some amount of canopy loss from EAB and treat it and still salvage that tree.
Okay.
It might require some follow-up trimming of that resulting deadwood.
Sure.
But it's been done. And I would encourage people to consider that if they're in that, kind of in-between area where it's like, I don't know, this tree, maybe you'll make it. The treatment's not that expensive. If you have a 20-inch ash tree, which is a good size tree, you're looking at probably around $100 to have it treated.
Oh,
and that's good.
A lot less than I would have anticipated.
Yeah, I get that reaction from a lot of people, and that's good for 2 years. So it's not even an annual treatment. It's $100 every other year for a tree like that.
Excellent.
So it's a lot cheaper than paying to have a tree that size removed.
Yes, I know some people who've had to do that recently. I was surprised at the cost.
Thousands of dollars.
Yes, absolutely. So invest the $100 if you have an ash tree.
Yeah.
And call Rainbow Tree Care.
It's usually the cheaper route, and I'm always happy to come look at people's trees. I go and look at private property all the time to give people advice about what they should do with their trees or their gardens or whatever they want to talk about.
Well, that's a great service. So. Yeah. Well, you're going to have people lining up outside your door.
I would love nothing more.
Well, good. Well, call Bennett, everybody, because, yes. Well, I think it is important, right? If people are doing projects or they're curious about, the tree ordinance or treating their tree, you are our preeminent expert in that field.
Yeah, and I enjoy doing that because, usually if you call to have somebody out to your house to look at your trees or whatever might be going on in your landscape, they're there to sell you something, and which is great. I mean, that's their job, but it's nice to be able to go there and provide kind of like a third party perspective. I'm not there I don't sell chemicals. I don't get paid to cut down trees. I'm going to tell you what I think is the healthiest route to take with your trees or your landscape. So
you have no skin in the game at that
point.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I think people see a lot of value in that perspective, so I'm happy to provide it.
Absolutely. Well, we're glad you are providing it for folks. So at the beginning of our conversation, you had made mention about the tree ordinance. So that's something new. We've talked about it a lot as a city, but we've recently implemented it. At a super high level, can you give folks, an idea of what the tree ordinance is and what needs to be done, so people understand what our expectations are of the community and...
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, the tree ordinance, generally speaking, is really just all the code that relates to our relationship with trees, public and private. But the changes that were made last October mostly had to do with a tree removal permit.
Okay.
So now, if you would like to take down a tree on your property, if it's 6 inches or greater at breast height, 4.5 feet up, and estimates are fine. You
sure.
don't have to. Right. Then we ask that you fill out a permit application to remove that tree, and really that it's so that we want to monitor what's going on, because like I was saying earlier, the canopy is all related.
Sure.
I mean, yes, some of it's private, some of it's public, but we want to monitor for disease or hazardous conditions. Because it allows us to make informed decisions as we make changes to the ordinance going forward, or decide what we want to plant on public property. What are we lacking in the overall canopy? We can try to address that ourselves if we have a better awareness of what's going on privately. And I should mention that with the tree removal permit, I get asked a lot, well, what about, diseased or dead trees? Good question. And when I see those applications, I'll go look at the tree. If I can see what you're talking about, I'll take note. This is the disease that I see in this part of town.
Yeah.
I'll waive the permit fee. I don't want it to be a burden on people to participate
Absolutely.
in the process. They're doing us a favor by filling that application out, and we want to, give them the okay to take a tree down when they need to.
Absolutely.
Without bringing a hassle. Yeah.
And we get a lot of calls too. I mean, we're very passionate about our trees. So as a council and staff, there are sometimes if somebody's deciding to do some tree trimming or needs to remove a tree and staff doesn't know about it, at least before we had this in place, then there were a lot of calls happening, maybe from neighbors, not understanding what's going on. And this way, this also allows us to just be a little bit more
in the know.
Exactly. Yeah. And can address people's questions and
absolutely
in a thoughtful way. So now you said you were doing an inventory or a canopy inventory.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have anybody who does that for their own property and provides that to you? Or is there any benefit to that? Would you see... Would that be helpful information for the city to have?
Yeah, it would. The standard tree inventory process that we go through utilizes the county's tree inventory software, and it's not a publicly accessible inventory, but it's a shared inventory between us and Woodland and
sure.
Any county entity that wants to contribute information. But we can, if we're on a private property in Wayzata where, it's like, well, there's oak wilt, it would be a good example.
Yeah.
We will take note of that in our inventory so that everybody's in the know. Whoever's using the county's inventory will be aware that
they can see trends.
Yes.
And, okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's good.
Yeah. And a lot of times, like when a property is redeveloped, say they had to take down a bunch of trees and they install a big, robust tree replacement plan. I'll often ask them, do you mind if I add this to our inventory? And I've never had anyone turn me down. They're like, yeah,
right.
Sure. Which is great. Because,
and that's part of the ordinance too, is that if there's part of construction or development, and certain types of trees are removed, there is a ratio of replacement that needs to occur.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so that then becomes part of our inventory in terms of that tree replacement plan.
Yep. It's a really great way, because that whole development process is very involved, and
right.
So I see it as a really good opportunity to gather that data, and usually everybody's on board, and so that's good. But yeah, the replacement process is a big part of the ordinance for sure.
Wonderful.
And that's actually been that way the past 2 or 3 iterations of our tree ordinance that's been in place. And it's like I said, it's quite involved. It's a big part of my job.
Sure.
Kind of, doing plan review and checking up on these trees after the fact. We do follow-ups where every, upon installation, then after 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, I'll revisit that site, see how the trees are doing. And then that developer owners gets back some of their escrow, which they use as a surety for this tree replacement plan.
Excellent.
So it's a big process, but it's an important one, and one that we take seriously.
That's great. Well, you have job security here with all the trees and plantings we have.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get away from business a little bit. I want to know a little bit more about Bennett. Favorite tree in Minnesota?
Oh man, that's a tough question. Can I give you 2 answers?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's do native.
There's no red buzzer here. You're good.
Let's do native and non-native.
Okay.
My favorite native has to be bur oak. It's got a absolutely incredible form. It's very irregular, but it tends to be very horizontal. It kind of looks like the live oaks that you'll see down south.
Okay.
It has very low, big, fat, low growing branches. Really good for a swing set.
Nice. Okay. I'm going to have to look that one up because I don't know that I'm picturing this particular type of tree.
You would recognize it immediately. They're
Okay.
very, very common in, like on the east side of town, Holdridge neighborhood.
Okay.
Has a lot of white and bur oak.
Excellent. All right.
Yeah,
and that's a non-native tree.
That's a native.
Oh, that is native.
Yep.
Okay. What about non-native? What's your favorite?
I would have to go with ginkgo.
Oh,
Are you familiar with that one?
I am, but I'm more familiar. Now, is there also a plant?
Well, does
it always develop into a tree?
There are like some dwarf varieties. I've actually got a couple in my garden at home that they're only a couple feet tall. It's kind of like a little bush, but it's actually this, genetically, it's the same thing.
Okay.
It's just a dwarf version.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. But usually it's kind of a medium-sized shade tree, and it's got those very, kind of triangular leaves, kind of a bright off green that you don't expect.
Like a lime green almost, right?
Like a lime green. And what's really cool is when they get to be full size, they do this early in life too, but it's dramatic when they're full size in the fall, their leaves turn like a bright yellow and they drop like within a few hours of each other. The whole tree is full of this beautiful color. And then one afternoon, it seems random, like, cause it doesn't even have to be windy necessarily. It's just all of a sudden the whole tree decides.
You look out your window and they're done.
Yeah. And it's just raining this beautiful color. It's an awesome tree.
Ah, I'll definitely have to look into that as well. Now, do you have an opportunity to travel much outside the state?
I do, but do you mind if I ask you a question before?
Sure.
What's your favorite tree?
Well, I think I'm going to answer with a non-answer. So in Minnesota, I love going to northern Minnesota, and I love the birch trees.
Good answer.
I love birch trees. And in the fall, the leaves, the way they're rustling and the colors, are just beautiful. Yeah. Outside of Minnesota, so I grew up on the East Coast outside of Washington, D.C.
Okay.
So I have 2 trees that just, whenever I think about them, I think of home and growing up. And those were the cherry blossom trees. which, I mean, just stunning.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then I don't even know the name of this tree. I know what my parents called it, but I think that was like a French name for it.
Okay. I don't speak French, but try me.
But what I liked, it had these branches with these little tiny leaves all around it. I mean, the leaves were literally maybe an inch, but there were so many of them.
Okay.
And it created this beautiful dappled shade. And then it would have these big, long, red, almost flowers, almost like a pod, but it was like a fuzzy type of.
And did it have blooms on it? Because I'm thinking locust tree.
It's not a locust. My parents called it like an acacia tree or something like that. I don't know.
Okay. I'll have to look into that.
But I really like, and then the birds just love this
I'm sure.
tree in the backyard. And so there always be all kinds of different birds in there. But the shade, instead of being like a dense shade, was this dappled shade, which I really liked. So those were like my favorite growing up. But the birch trees up north in northern Minnesota,
hard to beat that.
No, I just love that. And the bark, right? Yeah. And that's the other thing, right? How you can tell one tree from another just based on its bark and how distinctive it is. And it's just so beautiful. Now, all right, we're going to flip to the dark side.
Sure.
Do you have a least favorite tree? I mean, don't consider this like your favorite child, least favorite child.
Well, I only have one child, so that's pretty
so
easy.
You're safe. Okay. I mean, if trees are your children, I mean,
yeah,
we're going to take care of them all just the same, but
I'm not going to say buckthorn because that's more of a subshrub. I'm going to say I'm going to say box elder, and I feel bad saying that because they're important trees.
Yeah.
But man, are they ugly. They grow they have a horrible growth habit and they fall apart, they decay.
Do they bring the box elder bug?
They do.
Okay, see, now I'm with you. Absolutely.
Yeah, there's very little. I mean, the wildlife habitat side of them is wonderful.
Yes.
And I won't ignore that, and I'm not about to condemn the box elder people.
No.
But you're not going to find one anywhere near my house.
Okay. Yeah. So I have one that falls in that category. It's the cottonwood.
Oh, really?
I see people. I think it's a love-hate relationship with the cottonwood in my experience. I don't find their leaves to be particularly attractive in the fall. They're kind of just brown.
Yeah.
And then when it sheds the cotton, it's a mess.
Yep.
And me personally, it makes me sneeze like crazy.
Oh.
Just looking at it. I don't even think I'm allergic to it. I think it's psychological, but yes. And so I've heard from folks in the community, they either love the cottonwoods. They're like, can we please chop down every single cottonwood in town? I'm like, no, it's not our trees. You have to talk to your neighbor. But so I can understand, right? If it's not my tree and, and you want your lawn to look a particular way and then the cotton comes down, but
cottonwoods are messy. I'll give you that.
They are.
But you got to have respect for a tree that can be
so massive.
Yeah.
I know. No, it is impressive in terms of what it is. And yes.
But but for that reason, they can become scary when they get old and frail. Because sometimes those limbs that they drop are like whole trees of themselves.
That's true. Yes. And I'm thinking of one in particular in town, had to be 2 to 3 times the height of the house. I always thought about, oh my gosh, if a branch falls off of this one, the house could be in trouble. But it survived and it's doing great. And we know when to do the detour around town.
That's right. Yeah. If it's windy, take a different route.
Exactly. 100%. I have one other question for you, more personal curiosity. For a while, wildflower gardens, rain gardens were really kind of picking up steam. Do you still find that to be the case? Have they moved away from that? Are they finding other means for planting native flowers and having more drought tolerant plants and different watering mechanisms? What are you seeing?
So from my perspective, I've observed that same thing. About 10 years ago, there was a lot of talk about rain gardens and everyone wanted to have one. I don't think it went away. I think actually kind of the opposite happened. It seems like it's those techniques and that planting style has kind of just like morphed into just like standard landscape install.
Okay.
If you look around town, you'll notice that most of our newer landscape installations are sunken like a rain garden, for that exact reason. They're not like rain gardens per se, but that same principle is applied. The gardens are supposed to collect stormwater, not
so instead of mounding up.
Yes. Yeah, we don't want to divert it back onto some impervious surface. We want to collect it and filter it through these plants. And I think we found that palette of plants that are appropriate for a rain garden is actually quite broad. So in Wayzata, the Wayzata Boulevard medians are all sunken that way. And there's maples and elms and lindens and all sorts of different shrubs and flowering perennials and stuff. So yeah, I think the rain garden thing is here to stay. I think that's kind of just it's almost like a common sense thing now.
Sure.
And then the native thing, I think native plantings, people are really, that's about as passionate as you'll see anybody get about gardening, is when you talk about native species.
Sure.
And there's good reason for that. With the trees, I'm kind of torn about native stuff. I mean, they prioritize them for sure. My concern is that we can't achieve the level of diversity that we want if we were to stick to just native trees. Mm-hmm. Like I said, I think we should prioritize them because they are so important to the rest of the ecosystem.
Sure.
But every pest that comes in and takes out American elms, green ash, long before you and I were around, it was American chestnut. And now on the horizon, Asian longhorn beetle is likely to take out our maple trees. Those are all native trees.
Now you made my heart skip a beat.
I know.
Because we have so many beautiful, beautiful maples.
Right. And so every time this happens, our palette of native shade trees shrinks by a kind of a significant amount because it's not that big of a group of trees to begin with.
Yeah.
So every time that happens, we're limiting our potential diversity if we just do native shade trees. So I love them. I think we have to incorporate non-native stuff to keep our diversity up so we don't risk having, half the canopy taken out by the next pest. We can't take that gamble. But with like perennial landscape plantings, I think there's a lot that we could do there with native stuff because for a couple reasons. Perennial beds kind of by definition are they're not as long lived, meaning they grow faster. They're going to reach maturity in about 3 years. So you can kind of experiment without that concern that you might have with the broader tree canopy.
Sure.
Because it's easy to replace.
Yeah.
You could do all native, and actually it's a bigger palette to begin with. There's much more variety in our native flowering perennials than there is with our shade trees. So I think you can provide a lot of those same benefits with those smaller plantings, and then mix in some other stuff with our trees.
So in terms of, I have two final questions for you. One, if you have one piece of advice that you would give regarding landscape plantings or trees to our Wayzata residents, what would that one piece of advice be?
Sure.
And then I'll follow up with another question.
I think let's do a landscape bit. Because I think it's really important when you're laying out a new garden. A lot of people get hung up in the different bloom colors that they're expecting to get from these perennials.
That's me.
Well, it's an important consideration to make,
Sure.
but you give yourself a lot more flexibility and constant contrast if you instead look at what sort of colors you can get from the foliage, because that's there from like now virtually until frost or later. So if you start there, think about the colors of the leaves, because you can get blues, you can get obviously greens, you can get some reds, you can get some yellows, and that's there for the long run. The blooms, I think, are kind of like a nice little perk, you know, and it might just be for a few weeks in the middle of the growing season.
That is really good advice. Of course, that would totally overwhelm me, and I would shut my computer in a matter of a couple of hours. I mean, like, I can't. Too many choices.
Yeah.
I get overwhelmed. Pardon me. Okay, last question. So if you were going to provide resources, be it for landscaping or trees for our community, what are good resources for people to seek out if they have these questions?
Yeah, well, like I said before, I'm try to make myself available whenever I can. I'm happy to come look at people's property or talk to them on the phone, email, whatever you want to do. But if you're looking for other reputable resources, the U of M, I mean, is as good as it gets.
Is that the extension service?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Or there's something called U4, which is the Urban Forestry Outreach something. U4.
U4.
Yeah. And they're fantastic. They have species profiles for just about any tree that you might want to consider installing. They've got all sorts of really, really good information.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Any local, besides you or the University of Minnesota, we've got Rainbow.
Yeah.
Tree Care, so they can reach out to them as well if they want to treat their trees for emerald ash borer. Yeah,
and Rainbow does all sorts of other treatments too. Some of the common ones would be for bur oak blight or oak wilt. Magnolia scale is getting to be really common. It's almost kind of like you have to expect it if you plant a magnolia tree, but it's somewhat treatable if it's a preventative fungicide is applied. So they do lots of stuff like that, and there's others that do kind of technical tree trimming. Bartlett's great. We've used them. There's no shortage of. We have a lot of trees, so
we do.
There's lots of companies that can help people with stuff like that.
And just as a public service announcement, the ones that are under the electrical lines, that is not us that cuts those.
Right.
Yeah. So I know we don't like how they get cut, but they get cut like that for a reason. And that we don't have a say in that process.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess I would just say about that, I get frustrated by it too, but at the end of the day, you have to just remember it's either that or they cut the whole tree down in a lot of cases. Usually they do a pretty good job, all things considered. They got to maintain that clearance. And in my view, it's better that than cutting it down at the ground.
Absolutely. Well, Bennett, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, likewise.
I could talk about trees and flowers and plants for much longer, but
likewise.
Thank you very much. It's always great. And again, congratulations on all your recent accomplishments. And we're so happy to have you as our city forester.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. It was a blast.